From NATO and immigration to Brexit and British politics, America has a lot at stake in what's happening around the world. Today's guest is Harry Cole, the hugely popular journalist and investigative reporter with The Sun newspaper, who's broken major stories on government change and international scandal. And his reports on President Trump have become must-reading, no matter where you are. From Ballard Studios in Washington, D.C., it's 13th and Park.
You and I can differ, but that doesn't mean you and I cannot be friends.
That often is missing in politics.
We went from North Korea to M&M. That's a lot, man.
Aliens could have invaded and nothing would surprise me at this point.
It's a nightmare.
Those are the facts.
We have to solve everything.
What's in this tea?
Well, Harry, great to have you on the show from across the pond. I love saying that, across the pond. With all the things that you do in media and news, government and politics, you also have this wonderful podcast, Never Mind the Ballots. I had to ask you, where did the name come from, Never Mind the Ballots?
Hello from London. Well, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, but there's a Sex Pistols album called Never Mind the Something.
Right.
And we were looking for, the Sun as a brand. It can be very serious at times, but we like to inform and entertain. So it was almost perfect. The sort of irreverence of the Sun brand applied to politics. And obviously it was a massive election year in both the United States and the Great Britain this year. And it's kind of stuck.
Tell me, how has political discourse over in Great Britain changed, even across Europe? Maybe in reflection in part to the U.S. elections that just came in for a landing a few weeks ago.
So obviously we had a change of government in the UK the first time in 14 years. The previous Conservative administration went through some pretty crazy iterations over the years. So in a strange way, although there's been a lot of upheaval in the United Kingdom this year, it's almost sort of slightly back to normal upheaval. Instead of the Prime Minister being ousted by their own party, be that Theresa May or Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Liz Truss very briefly, it was more of a sort of traditional, the government went to the polls and lost. The incumbency factor was not helpful. After 14 years, post-COVID, post-inflation, post-energy crisis, and with all the mad sort of infighting that the previous government got themselves into, the writing was kind of on the wall. So really, for the first time in about 10 years in the United Kingdom, politics almost sort of went back to normal in the fact that, one party peacefully changed hands with the other, rather than it being, a big referendum that forced out a leader or sort of inter-party politics. That said, nothing's ever normal. Having been totally exhausted after sort of earlier than they thought the election campaign was going to be, the new Labour Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, he'd been travelling the country for 9-10 weeks, right, 20-hour days campaigning, and then they put you in charge of a NATO nuclear armed power on zero sleep, and you just got to run with it. And so where we are at the moment is sort of almost a sort of general sense of exhaustion. Speaking, a week or so before Christmas, there's a sort of feeling for the first time in many, many months in the UK right now, the time for a bit of a truce. We need a couple of weeks off. Everyone needs to charge their batteries because the frantic and manic pace of things has just been quite phenomenal, but not as crazy and weird as it has been in previous years.
I love your definition of normal, frankly, Harry. I mean, it's exhausting. So you just mentioned, the new prime minister, the change of parties to Labour. Already, I've seen in some of the polling, there's a lot of pressure on the new government to start producing. I mean, they basically just hit the ground, and there's almost seems to be a public unrest where things aren't moving or changing fast enough.
Yeah, if you crunch down the data, Keir Starmer, the reason that he is in office is because the total collapse of the government and the fracturing of the right in the United Kingdom. Reform, the Nigel Farage-led party got into the game late. They only won 5 seats, but they came second in around 95 seats, and 65 of those seats are in Labour, where they're second. So Labour was almost able to come through the middle and get a big majority in the House of Commons, despite the fact being actually not a particularly popular government. Their share of the vote was actually down on previous Labour government shares of the vote who'd gone on to lose elections. And Sir Keir Starmer entered Downing Street actually as the least popular arrival. His opinion poll ratings have only gone in one direction. He's now sort of into the negative 30s in terms of net popularity. And that's not a good place to be for any prime minister, let alone a prime minister 5 months in, especially at a time, and as we sort of briefly mentioned before, with Europe looking pretty fractious. People are very fluid with their votes now. And, a big majority, can be undone in one term, as we saw with Boris Johnson, Where I think the UK has got a bit of a blessing is it seems that the hard right, the far right of the United Kingdom, is not in any way as prominent as with what we're seeing in France, what we're seeing in Germany. And actually, if you look at the reviews of reform, they wouldn't have been out of place in the 1980s Conservative Party or even the 1990s Conservative Party, really. They're pretty mainstream anti-immigration, pro-public service views, public sector views. So we're blessed a little bit without the rest of the right. But Keir Starmer needs to be very careful, and he knows this, because there is no left-wing party that has successfully fought a right-wing populist movement. And if the Tories and Reform can get their act in gear, it's not guaranteed that he'll win another election. His majority is very big, but it's very wide and it's very shallow.
Yeah.
Without delivering results very quickly on the NHS, on the borders, on crime, his popularity has some way to go down yet.
Not to compare this to the royal family, the expression uneasy rests the head that wears the crown, right?
Indeed.
So you wrote this incredible book of the year about Liz Truss. You talk about a short-term engagement. What was that like to see how quickly it moved from behind her to going at her?
It was astonishing, really, because I'll tell you exactly why I did the book. I thought I knew a new government's coming in. No one really knows who this woman is. She's been biding her time in the slow lane for a long time. But as a sort of political journalist, also good time to sort of get into the new team, into the people around her, really get to know her. But I mean, the warning signs were all there. We didn't actually have to change a huge amount of the book, but it ended up basically going to the printers the day that she left Downing Street. So in a weird way, it sort of captured the slightly manic energy that period in British politics had, because Boris Johnson obviously was ousted. He sort of threw his tacit endorsement behind her, and it was pretty obvious that the Tory party membership were going to crown her. So really, from about a month and a half before she won, we knew that she was going to do it. So the book just kind of carried on. And God bless my editors at HarperCollins that let us do this. But it was very strange, because I was writing for the newspaper and covering the stories by day, and almost doing the first draft of history and getting the sort of behind the scenes details in the evenings through the night. And people would say, this is for the book, not for tomorrow's paper. And I was like, well, there's not a huge amount of difference, because tomorrow's paper is only 6 weeks ahead of the book. It's not like, this is not like something where you sort of pause, take temperature and look back at something. But I think it was important it worked, because it captured just quite how crazy that time was.
Let's shift to European impressions of President Trump. We just witnessed over here recently President Trump going to France to be a part of the reopening of Notre Dame. It seemed to be President Macron and President Trump had a very good chemistry. Was that just for the cameras, or is there a sense of potential opening with European leaders, not just in Great Britain, but across the continent, to what a Trump presidency actually may do in the affirmative, as opposed to past concerns about, NATO membership and funding and things of that nature?
So far, from what we've seen here, it is a different Donald Trump. It is a little bit more professional. We can get into his cabinet picks, which have caused some sort of scratching of heads over here. But I mean, in terms of the big ones, though, pretty fair picks. Marco Rubio, I think, went down very well. In the diplomatic world. They're like, right, yeah, that makes sense. We can see that. So I think the sort of charming, love-bombing Macron thing was more about they want to get ahead of the situation in Ukraine. Macron was always feels he's one of those people that thinks he's more sort of George Orwell than war. He was one of the last leaders really still talking to Putin hours before the tanks rolled over the border in February 22. So he has his own domestic woes, but he's trying to sort of play the sort of elder statesman. And also, if you think about it, he's one of the very few leaders who is still in power, in any democracy anyway, who's still in power last time Donald Trump was around. So he's got a bit of a head start there. Obviously, the sort of rivalry between France and Britain to be, we have the special relationship and France has the oldest relationship. So there's a bit of jousting there. But I mean, on defense security, I think Britain always has a head start in its relationship with any US administration. And the French are still very, very, very sore about Biden and the Australian-British submarine deal that cut out France. So they've got some catching up to do. And I think Macron naturally is a bit of a show-off, and he quite liked having the new guy with him. And, it was amazing what they did, turning Notre Dame around in 5 years. You've got to give Macron a little bit of credit there. The relationship with London, however, is a bit different because obviously we've got a Labour administration, a Labour administration that Donald Trump's new best friend, Elon Musk, has taken violently against in terms of, almost every day. You've got the richest man in the world essentially knocking Britain, saying it's a socialist, crime-ridden, knife crime hellhole where people are locked up for saying things on Twitter. It's a sort of grotesque characterization of what Britain is like at the moment, but the seeds of it are kind of there. You've got the Prime Minister trying to sort of cozy up to the Trump administration, while its most vocal cheerleader is literally knocking Britain. So we're in a bit of an awkward position at the moment, and no one's quite sure how it's going to go. This is not what Keir Starmer would have envisaged as his, more of the same under Kamala Harris would have suited him just fine.
Let me ask you this. So we went to school a little bit on Brexit and what led to Brexit, from what we could see from afar, which seems to be a reaction to people in your nation wanting to feel more of a sense of control of what was ahead, right? And in a way, Donald Trump, both in 16 and 24, his message was basically things are not secure, not in control, and we need to change. We need to change the system. We need to change the way we do things. Is there a parallel there between what led to Brexit and maybe what led to the reascension of Donald Trump?
It's fascinating what you say about being able to see from afar what the underlying causes, and almost a little bit easier to look at it from the perspective of the United States looking at the UK. I felt exactly the same this election cycle, looking at the United States. I wrote a piece in February, March. I was out there, and I just sort of got this feeling that this was going to be different this time. And that feeling never left me all the way through, even through to those remarkable images we saw in July with the assassination attempt. And then just this guy hitting his stride just at the right time, turning up in McDonald's, the garbage truck. And then I landed in New York about 4 days before polling day, and obviously soaked up a lot of US network television. And suddenly that was the first time I had to self-doubt in those final days, because watching it from afar, it was so obvious what was about to happen. And then as soon as you're on the ground there, it's almost like you're in a parallel election. The same thing going the other way with Brexit. Look, you're spot on. That feeling of, things aren't as good as they used to be. You can see the image of control being totally lost. The image of government impotence, be it in the Channel with the small boats coming across, or the southern border of the United States. There is no finer, not even a metaphor, it's reality of government failure. Then the one thing they're meant to do is protect the economy and protect the borders. And if they're failing on those two things, it's very quick that people will reach for different solutions. Now, there's a big argument, Brexit, whatever that means. I mean, Brexit in itself is not a destination. It's a process, and it's an ongoing process. And the smarter Brexiteers would always say this is a 10 to 15 year project. We're not going to be able to say whether this is a success or not until we do it. But we'll only be a success if we do it properly. And yes, we did leave the EU eventually. It took a while, and we do have a tariff-free, quota-free trade deal with the second largest trading bloc in the world. But then we sort of just stopped. COVID hit. We started talking about other things. We started talking about rebuilding the country, and we haven't actually taken quite as many of the steps that we could have done and probably should have done on deregulation, on taxation, on various things that would allow us to become more competitive in the world, because we're slightly still in the sort of orbit of the EU. And where I think Donald Trump's really interesting is he sort of gets that, and I think he could put quite a lot of pressure on the United Kingdom. If he was to almost put the penny on the scales and slightly tip Britain back into a more Anglo-Atlantic orbit, then I think that could get very interesting. But Nigel Farage obviously is the fascinating figure in all of this, because obviously he was a front man for Brexit. He was the one making it more about immigration than the economy. Farage was central to it, but he's also been central to the idea that the last 6 years, or God, how many years it's been since the referendum, it's been, we've almost a wasted opportunity. And it's almost like, if we had Brexited better, things would be okay. So he's very much trying to capitalize on that. And I think the reason the Tories got quite the pounding they did is that they did make a lot of promises on control. Control being the key word, as you mentioned. Take back control of our borders. Well, the UK left the EU, took back control of our borders. They left net migration into the United Kingdom was 500,000 a year. Last year, it was 900,000, nearly 1 million. And so we would say, well, that's not the control we were promised. And, they can then make an argument, it's about deciding who comes in, the best talented people. But it's just, once you're sort of explaining, you're losing, really. So there is a sort of feeling of not regret that we've done it, but regret that it hasn't been done in the way that it could. And yeah, I think Reform will be the people that really capitalize. I mean, look at the name of the party they've chosen.
Reform UK, right?
It's that sort of feeling that nothing quite works in this country. The trains don't run on time. The water's dirty. And you just think anyone that really capitalizes and really gets into that, sort of taps into that idea of what are we paying all this money for this substandard service, could make rich electoral hay.
So one of the things that you mentioned that Brexit focused on and was a number 2 issue, at least in the American election, immigration, right? Big deal throughout the EU. Big deal in America. You've seen what President Trump is suggesting, really tightening up the southern border and talking about beginning with deportation of illegals who have committed crimes. Now,
yes,
a lot of people want to have a more broader view of immigration, but for those that live on borders, not just in America, but across Europe, where they've been overrun, is this an issue that maybe all of Europe, Harry, is looking at America to see whether or not they can actually succeed in what they're now setting out to do?
Yeah, I mean, if you stood up and said we needed mass deportations 10 years ago, you would have been branded, a sort of racist psycho, right? But
Yeah.
the terms of debate have changed. Look at Italy, for example. They've been on the forefront of the migrant waves up through northern Africa onto their beaches. And, Giorgia Meloni, when she came into office, was branded, Nazi and fascist and all that. She's got the most stable government in Europe right now.
Right.
So the debate has changed so much. You've got Macron now, talking pretty tough on this. And even the Labour government in the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, a man who's campaigned for open borders in the past, he literally campaigned against deportation flights. There wasn't a baddie going in Britain that, as a lawyer, he wouldn't be willing to defend to keep him. And he's now, completely 180'd on that. Where America has got the advantage on this is they're not a member of the European Convention on Human Rights, which we've signed up for. They're not a member of a lot of the refugee conventions that we've signed off for. And these are the problems. And the political will, the public mood, and the public desire for deportations and people who have no right to be here, be it no right to be here and then be here and commit rape and murder and theft,
Right.
then there's no justification for not deporting them. But the human rights legal framework that they have in Europe is remarkable. And that's why the whole thing is basically stuck. And in the United Kingdom, the debate is beginning to move. And I suspect it will rapidly continue to move in the direction of, hang on, why have we signed up to this thing in 1947 or whenever it was, which had noble aims to begin with, but really is saying that the same rules, exactly the same rules apply now in terms of migration and and the ability of fixing your borders as they do in 1947, when people can move so more freely now to move around the world. So if not a sort of sustained movement to update the human rights legislation, I think if it continues to be that you'll start to see these sort of named individuals who have committed horrific crimes in the United Kingdom. And there was an example of one the other day. This guy has literally murdered his wife, and he is claiming that he can't be deported because he has a right to a family life. And you kind of surrendered your right to a family life, buddy, when you committed your crime, that crime especially. And yet this stuff gets heard in court and it just gets bogged down, and these things take months and years. So Donald Trump will find it easier in the United States, I suspect, but the scale in which you're going to have to do this in order to make an impact is going to require A, a lot of money, and B, a lot of political will, because the opponents of it are just better armed and better organized.
So, Harry, you've covered Westminster for a long time. You've broken all sorts of stories on political scandals. Matt Hancock comes to mind, but there's so many others. What was your favorite story? Or maybe what is your favorite story that's still unresolved that you're looking into right now?
So it's something I worked on for a long time, and I'm not just saying this because I'm across the pond. I don't know if you remember it, but there was an awful incident about 5-6 years ago where the wife of a diplomat stationed in the UK was driving down the wrong side of the road and killed an 18-year-old motorcyclist. And we couldn't really work out why she ended up on a plane, basically, and got out of the country and left. You can claim diplomatic immunity, but not technically, if you're a spouse, you're meant to surrender it. Anyway, so we ended up proving that she was in fact in the CIA. The Brits and the Americans had hundreds of these secret treaties that allow American service personnel to basically act with complete immunity across the UK in secret that no one knew about until these cases. And then also our own government had given her the wink to get on a plane and go without telling this poor, the poor family of this man had been killed. Astonishing story, and it ran and ran and ran. She eventually then did, via video link at least, across the pond, appear in court and was found guilty. But it took 2 years, 2.5 years to get there. And that's just one of those stories that I like, trading in scandal and gossip and political intrigue and leadership elections and general elections as much as the next political hack. But sometimes you just get a story where the sense of injustice is so clear that actually it sort of makes you angry that no one else can see it, and then you just kind of keep going and keep going and keep going. But that's the one that's I've always thought of as my good deed.
Well, I'll tell you, that sounds like a made-for-TV Netflix series that you should do the screenplay on.
Yeah, no, they're a remarkable family that went through who were very poorly treated by their own government.
Well, Harry, I really appreciate all your time. We all appreciate, by the way, your perspectives, not just on politics and government in and beyond Great Britain, but on America, too. It's important that everyone understands a worldview to maybe have a better sense of direction and track. Your reporting is widely followed. Your podcast is amazing, very interesting stuff. I'm a fan of well-produced, theater podcasts being number one on the list now. I encourage you to keep doing what you're doing because you shed light on things that people don't understand, don't know, and need to understand and need to know to be better informed and more a part of the future to be.
Thank you. That's very kind. And no, we've always got a friend in London, so maybe we'll come back and chat when we work out how bad Donald Trump really has been.
I think probably over a few beers, but yes.
I think it's going to be okay this time. Don't you worry.
Harry, take care of yourself. Be
good. Take care.